En fait, j'aimerais trop bien continuer en français, mais ça sera insupportable après 2 minutes. So I will indeed switch to English again. I was actually remembering as we were talking about re-traumatization earlier, and I did remember many years ago I did my part of my psychiatry training at the Lyon hospital. So this was really just around the corner. And I don't know, this was towards the end of the year when I was studying in France, how all this came about. But basically, I found myself in the really quite horrible situation of having to do a ward round at 9 o'clock in the morning, just with the head nurse, because still at that time my French was so incredibly bad. I completely missed the communication with my fellow students, and it so happened that people were on a strike, so I was the only one walking up there on my own. Had to take a very non-mentalizing stance, because I basically entered into each of the rooms saying, is everything okay? I know you're fine, we'll see you tomorrow. So there was not much of the not knowing applied in that context. So thank you very much for the translation. I think we'll be much better off with me continuing in English. So just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to cover. It's essentially, if you will, it's essentially trying to bring some of the things together that we've heard today from a clinician scientist perspective. So I will briefly introduce why I think secure attachment and epistemic trust are the prerequisites for the development of interpersonal generative models, so models of self and other, or models of the self in relation to others. I will then propose this notion of the Bayesian infant, and just to, because we've used the term a few times already, just to demystify it a little bit. Thomas Bayes was an English Presbyterian minister mathematician, so that's where this word really comes from. So he's been more post-mortem really been quite an influential figure with regards to contemporary mathematics at this stage. For the second part, I would then like to address how these interpersonal generative models come about and can be characterized in severe psychopathology, namely in personality disorders. And then if there's a little bit of time left towards the end, I'd like to talk a bit about some ongoing work in at UCL in London, in Reid Montague's lab, and support some of what I think is important about this developmental notion of the Bayesian infant from an investigation of adult psychopathology. And just a little preface as well, because I know Dickon called this of the graveyard shift after lunch. So I'm not quite sure where we are right now, but it's incredible that you're still here, and hopefully you will take something away from us still. But it's at the same time really quite impressive how not just a few things I think have come together over those 2 days. So that does really pay tribute to how Martin has been curating those 2 days. I hope that I won't introduce more confusion with what's to come now. I'm likely to fail to a certain extent at least, but if that's the case, we have someone who can hopefully sort things out a bit, because Patrick's task at those conferences is to an extent to bring things together again and to reintroduce coherence in the case they got lost along the way. So if you can bear with me, he will rectify things later on. You will hopefully also see that some of the ideas will intersect with the previous presentation. So hopefully you can make a few links and put things together yourselves. But I would like to acknowledge a number of people who are really quite influential in sort of helping me develop my own ideas. And namely, as I will draw upon this rather large-scale ongoing study at UCL, that there's a lot of things that are to be said about the patients who have really helped us to collect data at this in a particular stage, and also the whole research team that's involved in data collection. So let's start with the first part, and really by revisiting and making sure that we have a kind of common vantage point with regards to contemporary attachment theory. We've heard quite a lot of things about that already, particularly so this morning. But the main aspect really is, so that's how we see it. We see attachment security as isomorphic with epistemic trust. So that's to say that there's attachment security creates a system, a benign relational sort of interpersonal area in which information can be relayed essentially by a caregiver to the developing infant. And we've heard a bit, I'm glad that you did that by Karen and Dickon already about epistemic trust earlier on today. And my definition is probably going to be even more narrow because to me it's particularly important with regards to these developing generative models that what's being relayed, so the content of what's being relayed, is to do with a secure environment of learning about one's own mental states and the mental states of others. So it's not just, or maybe not so much primarily focused on a secure environment, but it's really about something to do with specific content, how we make sense of ourselves and others. So in other words, the kind of the initial building blocks of mentalizing. And we do have, from a couple of studies, we do have relatively good evidence in infancy, this is not about adults, in infancy that there is a cognitive advantage of secure attachment. So securely attached children do learn better when it comes to contingency learning than those who are non-securely attached, or certainly characterized by disorganized attachment. Oh, that's Patrick again. I don't know why that came about. Let's also, I thought it's important because things evolve, but let's also revisit Peter Fonagy and Mary Target's initial developmental model, both of normal development and also sort of the aberrations of that to do, or which characterize and bring forward a proneness to the development of personality disorders. So this is good enough parenting. So this is really in a truly Winnicottian sense if things go relatively well, which is not to say that they're always optimal. If we have an infant in a constitutional state of some kind of physical bodily arousal, that could be an infant being hungry, some physical discomfort, some emotional state, some upsetness. Usually this will get non-verbally expressed or signaled to the caregiver. And this is where we've heard some beautiful elaboration by Daniel Schechter, where parental reflective functioning really comes into play quite crucially, is that if the caregiver resonates with the experience of the infant and then is able to reflect, digest, metabolize these experiences, and to express them via the help of marked mirroring back to the infant, then gradually the infant will be able to incorporate those mirrored experiences, which will then essentially lead to something that we think is a symbolic organization of an internal state, and finally a switch from these primary representations of self and other to second-order representations of what it's like to be experiencing a mental state. And critically, and that, if you will, is a bit of a further development of this original model, is that the kind of interpersonal space, which is important here, that's characterized, if it goes well enough, by secure attachment and epistemic trust. And the tiny little bit which I would like to add, that's really what the subsequent part of the talk is about. What I would like to add is that this we could think about as the training ground for the acquisition of generative models of self and other. For those of you who may struggle a bit with that, it's in a way fairly close to a psychological notion of internal working models. So if you think about Judy Rousseau's talk earlier on, what are the expectations that enter upon a relational experience? And we will see in a moment that we can really quite well get to a mechanistic understanding of these aspects, a mechanistic understanding that we can map onto brain processes. That's kind of the idea behind the talk. I think I might skip that because a lot of it we have covered already, but if we just keep in mind before I venture on to talk about the Bayesian Infant, if we just keep in mind that therapy, because that's essentially what we'll be looking at when we're working with adults primarily, that it's not about the what, but the how of learning, then this takes us back to the kind of ossification or the rigidity of interpersonal experiences and how one comes to think about them, how, in other words, one mentalizes them. That's what I would like to be able to explain with a more mechanistic account, really. So let's think about this Bayesian infant. And I'll start off by a very kind of simple heuristic of what Bayes' theorem in terms of brain processing, what it's like. So if we think of let's say, a precocious infant, maybe even a newborn who experiences his or her first day. So let's say it's about, as in the picture here, it's time, to go to bed. It's sunset, and this infant, as it's his or her first day, might be a bit of an apocalyptic infant who doesn't quite know, is this the end? Will I survive? Will I be around again the next day? This infant has to probabilistically make assumptions about what the future will hold. So at this point, there are only two outcomes, really. It could be that there is a next morning, the sun rises again, or that that's not the case. So as our infant is a bit precocious, she indicates that by putting both a white and a black marble for those two outcomes into a bag. And then, as this is a blissful environment, the infant wakes up again the next morning, woken up by the sunrise. The infant then adds another white marble, which is indicative of the outcome of there being another sunrise into this bag, and does the same again and again. With every new day, the infant does the same, so that from a 50-50% chance, if we have the next day, we'd already be looking at 2/3 of probability of there being another day, and then 75% and so on. The guess of the infant will develop to something that's much more to do with certainty. So the infant will develop a kind of growing model of what's to be expected in the future. And with that model, as it's been updated time and time again in an iterative fashion, because there's always been new evidence that got accumulated and factored into the model, that model will help, that's the critical part really, that model will help for the infant to reduce the level of uncertainty or surprise with regards to a future outcome. That's sort of a very, very basic principle of Bayes' theorem. And hopefully, because that will take us a bit closer again to what's important to us as clinicians or researchers trying to understand these phenomena underpinning mentalizing, you could very easily transpose this notion to the interpersonal realm. So if you think of an infant, and you could even trace, if you wanted to apply even a psychoanalytic notion without wanting to overstretch, say, Kleinian theory too much. But you could, for example, take that back to the very early idea of what a child or an infant makes of a mother's breast. Is the breast available? Is it always there? Can I develop a rudimentary, at least, model of what's going to be there for me and what sort of responsiveness I may receive from a caregiver? That's kind of the basic idea. Before we continue thinking about it, let's also revisit some of the building blocks of our understanding or the characteristics of mentalizing, really, because I think it has some relevance to understanding the developing Bayesian infant. So we have as a starting point that the fact that mental states are opaque, that we can only, in other words, make inferences about them. That's the probabilistic aspect of it, and those inferences, or by making them, we are prone to getting it wrong. So in other words, there's no absolute certainty. But the important aspect that within that relational training ground for learning about one's own mental states and the mental states of others, it is really epistemic trust that facilitates via the caregiver a benign curiosity, both in the infant and in the exchange with its environment, to open up these generative models of what the future holds with regards to, say, incorporating both negative aspects, positive aspects, and it's much more important, actually, and it takes us back to the theme of the conference, to render them so that they're both adaptive and that they are flexible as well, so that they're not rigid, but they can incorporate and thereby predict all sorts of outcomes to be expected. And that's something we will see again when we start thinking about what these models are like in severe psychopathology. And again, clinically or developmentally speaking, taking this inquisitive stance, that's really the principle that epistemic trust allows for, because via an environment that is characterized by epistemic trust and this benign curiosity, only then can a whole range, a variety of mental states be explored and experienced by an infant. And those models, if you will, can be enriched by those facts. Okay, now this is the part where it gets a little bit technical, but hopefully not too much. But I think it's important. I try to convey to you a little bit about what how the brain, or we may think about it, at least we could put forward a hypothesis, how the brain may work and how the brain does really compute these generative models. So we could really think of the brain as a statistical organ that generates hypotheses about and fantasies, which are then tested against the sort of perceptory evidence. So that's what I was trying to say early on. If we have this very simple model as a starting ground, an infant will then explore its environment, particularly so its interpersonal relationships with others, and gradually update these very impoverished early models to render them much more complex and to render them in such a way that they can account for more outcomes in the future. And there's a particular way of how people, and this is mainly attributable to Carl Friston and his group in London, there's a particular way of how we think the brain does construct these generative models. And again, the heuristics for that are relatively simple and straightforward, because you could think of a hierarchy of different levels, different cortical levels in the brain. They all, at certain points, will make predictions about the hidden causes in the world. So that's how I would expect you to be feeling right now, or any given individual. And then those models are tested against the reality evidence, with the critical aspect that if there is a mismatch between what's predicted and what I have received as sensory evidence, the brain then produces a very strong signal, which we call a prediction error signal. So that's just indicative of this mismatch. And these prediction errors, they drive the updating of the generative models. So if one is flexible to account for new evidence and to update one's models, then those will in turn become much more precise and more accurate and more flexible. That's kind of the main aspect here. Now, if we take a more developmental stance on this, then we have to also incorporate or think about why this is maybe not the case for everyone. Why, especially, let's say, for example, children with maltreatment experiences, why they have rather rigid, or these, as I call them earlier on, ossified generative models of interpersonal experiences. And that's really because the generative models, they do allow an infant to develop with its own developmental niche. So it might, in other words, be extremely important if you have, let's say, a father who might physically abuse you every other day, or when he comes home drunk. You may have to have a very precise model, but at the same time a very narrow one, because it might not be so important to think about the benign aspects about that father, because maybe at other times he could be the most loving one to have fun with, one who would take you out to a football match. Might be much more psychologically crucial in terms of psychological survival to get it spot on when this father might be out there and up for beating you. So that's where a generative model becomes very impoverished. That's still very adaptive for the particular developmental niche of this given individual, but it's probably something that would get this person into trouble when it came to generalizing from it and to applying it to different relationships, certainly if they were therapeutic ones. So as we're still in the realm of the kind of good enough development, then it's important to think of, the quality of these generative models as primarily modulated by the level of epistemic trust that one experiences with one's caregiver. Okay, and it's actually Carl Friston, and that takes us a bit back to Dick and Bevington's rocket science from early on, who is a hardcore neuroscientist. He is interestingly saying if indeed the brain is a generative model of the world, then much of it must be occupied by modeling other people. So that's in a way a bit of a relief, because even within hardcore cognitive neuroscience, people are starting to realize that the social world is something that is of paramount influence. And he even goes as far as saying, that he would attribute 95%, which is, a wild guess, obviously, but a lot of the computational power of the brain is really to do with modeling oneself and oneself in relation to other people. Okay, to introduce another more computational aspect to this, you could think of, or that the driving principle behind the brain's development of these models is that the brain is intrinsically interested, if one wanted to attribute motivation to it, in reducing surprise. There's a sort of complementary notion, which is to say in reducing free energy. So the brain wants to work as efficiently with regards to its accuracy in predicting outcome that's to be expected, so that a lot of its computational power can be used, for example, for other resources or for parallel processing. So there's this idea that the generative models should be really quite spot on in terms of capturing something that's in a person's sensorium. And there are two critical ways in how one can reduce those prediction errors and thereby reduce uncertainty or surprise. One is really that a simple way of changing the generative models. So that's just the updating that I've been talking about. If there's new evidence, I accumulate that, I update my models, and therefore I render them more accurate. Or, and that's something I had Anthony's patience in mind when I was thinking about this. There's a second alternative, which is by acting upon one's experiences. In other words, by changing the world so that the world fits my predictions and my generative models much more. And if you think of some of the patients, the antisocial patients he was talking about, that's really what they're doing in a very powerful way. They do change reality so that it fits with what's important to them, what they're expecting. Ignore the formula here. It's, I understand about 2% of them is merely to impress you. Let's focus on this lower part here. If we have, and that's again, we're not talking this, these are examples because they have been mapped out in say, the visual cortex and our understanding of vision much more so than in the social or interpersonal realm. But let's assume this is something that we encounter in our visual field. And this is another heuristic of the way the Bayesian brain notion would put things forward. So we would then have an idea, we would have a generative model of the hidden causes that may have caused this perception, okay? Could be something like this. So our model is, if we see, this particular shadow of a howling dog, then we attribute to that the kind of the presence of a dog or wolf in this particular way. If that's not the case, if it's, for example, something like this that's caused it, then our brain would produce this very powerful prediction error, which would then drive the updating of our original generative model here, okay? And just, maybe just to summarize this little bit of technical notion there. So as I was saying, the biological agents, they minimize their average surprise. So they want to reduce chaos, they want to reduce uncertainty and entropy, and they do that using two different alternatives, if you will. They are driven by reduction of prediction errors that could be done or achieved by adjusting one's generative models, so the expectations change, or it can be achieved by acting upon the world to render the world closer to the actual models. And this has been mapped out relatively nicely, as I was saying, for the visual field. I'm just using this for illustrative purposes. So this is how you can, in a way, how you can think about this. So you have descending predictions from cortical structures within this prediction-making hierarchy. And then whenever you compare that against your sensual input, whether that's visual, auditory, interpersonal experiences, that's really what we care about here. If that doesn't match your predictions, then these strong prediction error signals within the hierarchy get passed on from one level to the next, and the models get updated to render them more accurate. And that's just another illustration, because there are certain phenomena where empirical work has demonstrated that this kind of conceptualization is indeed equivalent to how the brain works. So that one could identify particular structures within layers of the brain that behave exactly as these models suggest. And what can be identified is something that we call canonical microcircuits of predictive coding. And the next step, which I will hopefully show you in a moment, is that, because that hasn't really been done yet empirically, that those should be developed for what we think is underpinning sort of social interactions and certainly mentalizing. So that's kind of, that's a scientific project, so to speak. But let's leave that behind for a little moment now, and let's think about how these generative models, how they are different in severe psychopathology. So let's say in the phase of maltreatment or childhood abuse. So I think it was Karen Ensing who did talk about the notion of, and I think others today as well, the notion of the alien self. So in other words, if the intentionality of an infant is not metabolized by the caregiver, or if discontinuities in one's own self-experience, if they arise, and then if what results from it is this coercive controlling, you can probably see already that that's in a way a mapping onto this acting upon one's own generative models in order to make reality close to what one is expecting. Okay? And if that's something where, if we assume that where not just an individual is sort of affected by these impoverished generative models, but if it's maybe a whole family system, if you think back to Aya Arsen's work of multiple family therapy, where maybe a lot of people come together with these large prediction errors, then you can, in a way, imagine that chaos ensues and that there's not much understanding going on anymore. It's this disintegration or these sort of reversion to pre-mentalizing modes as a result of let's say, childhood severity. So the hallmark really of those interactions would be to do with pronounced interpersonal prediction errors. Yeah, because things are not as those patients, for example, would expect things. So what then ensues, and I'm going to skip that, is something that we all know about, those of us who are working with personality disordered patients. And we do think within this Bayesian framework that the common etiological pathway is really to be found in these impoverished generative models of self and other. So that's in a way, if you want to link it to Peter Fonagy's talk, that's in a way where the P factor might come into play. Yeah, so the impoverished generative or very inflexible generative models, they might be to do really with them something that presents like a vulnerability factor, for example. And this is particularly so the case, as Patrick and Peter have put forward, if we're not talking about baseline affective interactions, but if this has been taken a step further and one finds oneself in a situation of heightened affective arousal or interpersonal stress or attachment-related stress, then really what happens is this phenomenon that as Dickon was pointing out earlier on, that this epistemic superhighway where one is open to social information really shuts down, and the clinical phenomena ensure that patients don't listen to the potential benign interventions that you may have at offer to them. Okay, and now I'm just going to use a little bit of time at the end to talk you through something that we're doing at the moment in order to really investigate the developmental sequelae of these Bayesian infant impoverished generative models. Because we're not, unfortunately, studying infants, but we're investigating patients with personalities, also adult patients. But we could think about these epiphenomena as resulting from, these generative models that have been laid down in early infancy. So there's good understanding about how the brain works. There's good understanding about behavior, moods, and thoughts, but what is lacking is to an extent a mechanistic understanding how the brain really computes certain processes. And whenever I talk about brain processes, I'm particularly interested in the social brain and how one makes sense of social interactions and mentalizing. So there's been tremendous work in mapping, and successfully so in mapping the social brain. There's good converging evidence that there are key neural structures or a whole neural circuitry that's underpinning social cognition or the mentalizing brain. And that's just to confuse you even more, there are a few of those areas that would always crop up in studies that are anything to do with social cognition. But think of those, that's already a big step forward because we have identified those. But what we haven't really achieved yet is to see how the brain does perform its minute computations within those structures. And that's where the computational psychiatry approach might be. This is all with a big question mark, might be a useful one to shed further light on this, to kind of break it down to an even more detailed level. So the approach in this empirical study that we're taking is to study borderline and antisocial personality disorders with the help of neuroeconomic paradigms. I'm going to introduce one of those very briefly to you in a moment. But the overarching idea really is to have several vectors from each of these paradigms so that we can construct multiple dimensions of impairment, interpersonal impairment really of these patients. It goes back a little bit to Peter's criticism of the diagnostic systems of the DSM-5, for example, because this could maybe allow for thinking about some of the symptomatology phenomena along several continua. And then you could maybe locate a cluster of BPD patients with more impairment and interpersonal trust and contrast those with others who have more of a sort of, I don't know, dominance or aggressive aspect. So you can hopefully, with the help of this, construct a multidimensional grid later on where you can subcluster these patients and not treat them as one category, but rather dimensionally. That's a bit the idea behind it. This is just to give you an overview of the paradigms we're using. So you can see here that some are to do with sort of more higher order theory of mind or mentalizing. Some are to do with how one types others strategically in an interaction. There's something about dominance and aggression. There's certainly something about interpersonal suspiciousness and interpersonal trust. And it's indeed, I'm going to skip this in a moment, it's indeed this one particular task I would like to dwell on for the remaining 2 minutes, which is called the trust game. So that's a two-party interaction over 10 rounds. That's the important aspect, because we have two players, one usually the patient, the other one either another person or a computer agent who behaves like another person. But something develops over time, because this is iterative, this is over 10 rounds, so you could think of it, even though it's a monetary exchange, but you could think of a relationship developing over time as people go along playing this. So the way this works is that you have an investor and a trustee. The investor is endowed with a particular amount of money, can decide how much to pass on to the trustee, and then the trustee sends some proportion back to the investor. So in other words, all this is about exchanging interpersonal signals of trust, of cooperation, of a willingness to avoid, for example, inequality, and that's what we're trying to exploit. And we've already made some quite good inroads into this, in particular in having a kind of a mathematical framework to characterize peoples according to their theory of mind levels. So that's, for example, a level of -1 here would characterize someone who is assuming an impersonal environment, as if there was no other really. And you can think about this as increasing in complexity. So an endpoint could be an extremely high level where I have an idea of how Martin and I would be engaged in this paradigm, where he thinks about my model of himself as influenced by 5 rounds previously that we've interacted with. So it gets quite complicated quite easily, and you can imagine that some of the patients have more difficulties with that than others, for example. And we have some good evidence already in BPD patients that, for example, well, let's start with the healthy controls here. In the healthy controls, if they are at the receiving end, if they're the trustee, so those who receive money, at their bilateral anterior insula, a brain region that's really about interoception, about signaling levels of fairness, how one feels inside. This particular brain region seems to quite nicely parametrically map onto the level of unfairness of the offers that those people have received in this game. And that is completely absent in the BPD patients. So the BPD patients, completely indifferently of what they received, would always have a high activity in this brain area that's to do with signaling, I'm not happy with something unfair is going on here, I'm feeling hard done by. Yeah, so they lack this differentiation. And the last point really, and then I think I'm at the end, is that we've now sort of taken that a little bit further, because we've placed some of our patients in the investor role. If you imagine that's a player one, the player who's in charge, and then another part carefully matched in the trustee role, that's the people at the receiving end. And the key message with a lot of computation, a lot of mathematics going on, which some people in the lab have done, is that there's some interesting aspect that if the patients are in the control role where they feel in charge, they're actually on a number of indices and parameters. There are no differences in comparison to the healthy controls. There's something about the exposure to the receiving end where there's a lack of a locus of control, where there's a feeling of rejection, as we've heard earlier about this hyperbole paradigm, where they're really mentalizing or cooperation and this modeling of a back and forth relationship breaks down. So then all of a sudden disease states are being induced, which we don't see if BPD patients are in this sort of in charge role. That's just an initial sort of result from this ongoing effort, and we're only at the starting point of analyzing this quite rich data set further. So maybe I'll just leave you with the conclusions during questions. One thing that I would want to add, though, if you have a look at this, one aspect I think, because we've heard so much about our own developing clinical and theoretical models, is, and as I've been going on about the importance of the generative models so much, we should not forget that also if we enter into a consulting room, that we also have generative models of what we are expecting to see. So we may have impoverished or very sophisticated models of how we expect a personality disorder patient to present in our consulting room. So in other words, there's a big case to be made about ongoing work on fine-tuning these models about how we conceive of psychopathology. That's just to get us back to the flexibility notion. Thank you very
much. Thank you, Toby. Whilst people are thinking about a question or two, and we have about 5 minutes for questions, I have a few questions. How could we relate this to clinical work? And I think that you're doing it actually in the last phrase here of the not knowing stance in therapy, which would facilitate reorganization. But then I had another thought about trauma. Mm-hmm. And because you seem to be saying that if the brain is a predictive model, it seeks to capitalize on surprise. Because it's never going to annul surprise, right? Mm-hmm. But if there's too much surprise, then there can be a generative effect on how your brain organ is predicting, right? Mm-hmm. So that's is there a Bayesian model of trauma which goes as the first step something about surprise, mm-hmm. extreme surprise, and the second step, this whole process of traumatization thereafter, potentially traumatization thereafter, in its effect of how it's skewing the predictive coding brain, or resiliently, how the predictive coding resilient brain can, manage that surprise. I don't know if there's a paper on this, or
I think there is. I mean, one of the aspects, if you go back to these prediction errors, say if there's a very large one, and it's maybe even at a point of, simply speaking, the brain having to shut down at the face of some very overwhelming experience, then one could think of as this generating so much surprise that there's really a switch, from a generative model which gets. I'm using neuroscience terminology now. It switched from one model to another one. Yeah. So discarding one and having to rely upon a rather narrow new one. The aspect about those prediction errors is that they are also very closely linked with synaptic gains. So if you have them constantly in an iterative fashion, then certain plasticity aspects of the brain, they will get enforced. So neural, synaptic pruning, if it was a sort of downsizing or particular strengthening of alternative connections, that happens as an effect of prediction error signals. So then one would have to think about, what the extent of a very large one is in sort of, shifting from one system to another one. That's probably something to do with this structural-functional relationship that David was talking about, the one that Peter hopes will prevent him from developing dementia, that there's something about plasticity and adaptation in there, as it's not only one network, but there could be compensation in the use of others. And the inverse one could think of in the face of trauma, I think.
Yeah, so thanks. You're really, I think, painting a quite complex and multi-layer view of these models that we use to understand ourselves and others. And so I think that is a very promising field of investigation. I think that we'll move on to the next presentation out of issue of